An historic ruling came down earlier this week from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. Canada discriminates against First Nation children on reserves. Joining us now for more on the ruling and what it might mean going forward. In Kenora, Ontario via Skype, Teresa Stevens, Executive Director of the Anishinaabe-Abenuje Family Services. And here in studio, Sarah Clark, Counsel for the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and a lawyer at Clark Child and Family Law. And it's great to have both of you with us on TVO tonight for what I understand is your first television appearance for both of you. So great to have you here. And Teresa, I want to start with you. How important was it for you to hear this ruling?
I was overjoyed when I heard the ruling because I realized the impact that this is going to have on our children and the families moving forward. So I was overjoyed to hear the ruling.
Did you take it as a kind of a confirmation of everything you've believed up until now?
I took it as a confirmation that the tribunal heard what I was saying. So I talked about the suffering that our children and families went through in the 60s scoop, and they heard that and they acknowledged that pain and suffering and how that legacy has had an impact on our current child welfare system today. And they also acknowledged that in Ontario under the 65, that there's many gaps in services for children on reserve that need to be implemented as soon as possible.
We should just clarify, as you just suggested, you did testify before this hearing, and when the tribunal says that there was a failure by the Government of Canada to provide adequate services, what kinds of services is that ruling referring to?
It's referring to all the children's services that are available to the rest of Canadian children. So children's mental health services on reserve, physiotherapy, speech language developmental services. We have a need for a treatment center in the north, and I've been saying the same litany of needs for the past 10 years, and that includes spending $2 to $3 million a year sending children away because we don't have the resources to meet their needs in the north.
Sarah, let me get reaction from you. When you heard the verdict, what did you think?
Overjoyed. Really, really happy, exhausted, but just overjoyed.
What was your involvement in the whole process?
So I started working with the Caring Society actually as a social work student back in 2003, and then have been involved at different times in the case. Was involved at the Federal Court and the Federal Court of Appeal, where we were successfully able to get the complaint back on track, and then assisted at the final stage of drafting the final written submissions for the tribunal and presenting final oral argument.
Now, the failures that you have the decision in front of you right there. The litany of failures that the decision outlines, how far back in time do they go?
Well, it really looks at the current funding mechanism, which has been in place since 1989, and the federal government has been funding on-reserve agencies since that time, and so it really looks at how the formula has developed over the number of years and the failures all along the way. Even though the formula has changed in multiple different provinces over time, the failures continue to be repeated and the inequities continue to be compounded.
So we're talking a quarter century or more.
And as Teresa said, it really is an extension of the 60s scoop and residential school, where the government has used its lack of funding and lack of caring for these children to really give them less than every other Canadian child.
Teresa, that's an expression we hear from time to time, and I just want to make sure everybody knows what it means. The 60s scoop, what does that refer to?
That refers to the period of time following the ability of the provinces to go on reserve to provide child welfare services. It resulted in an en masse apprehension of children from First Nations, and in particular our communities in Treaty 3 were devastated by the 60s scoop.
So would it be too harsh to say, in your opinion, that what's been happening to the children referred to in this decision is in some respects a kind of a continuation of the kind of treatment that First Nations people experienced in residential schools, for example?
I would say up until the point that we began to take over our own child welfare services. So in Treaty 3, we have a practice of customary care, which has been in place for 30 years. And so our First Nations have been able to gain more control over their child and family services and have direct input on how those services provided. So in some ways, it has been better, but again, we're trying to fit into funding formulas that don't work for us and for tools and standards that aren't appropriate for us at the same time.
Sarah, as you look through the decision, were you able to come to any conclusions as to whether or not the various governments over the last quarter century knew they were failing in this area and didn't care anyway?
100% they knew. I think one of the great things that the tribunal does in delivering its decision is reflects on the evidence that was presented. And the evidence presented in this case came from multiple sources, but two sources in particular are Indian Affairs' own internal documents that really they did a very good job documenting their own inequalities to these children, as well as multiple studies that were done in partnership between First Nation organizations like the Caring Society, like Assembly of First Nations, and Indian Affairs. So they knew, arguably as early as 1999, that they were underfunding these kids between 22% to 34% less than all other Canadian children. So they've known for a very, very long time that they've been doing this.
They've known, but Teresa, let's make sure we understand this clearly. They've known, but did the tribunal come to any conclusions as to whether or not it believes governments of various stripes acted with, let's call it, wanton disregard for the fact that they were failing First Nations kids? Can you come to that conclusion?
I think that's a fair statement when, as Sarah mentioned, that there's been numerous studies over the years, including our own Auditor General, both in nationally and in Ontario, have identified the gap in services and the need for appropriate funding levels for the Aboriginal children in Ontario. So I think that's a fair statement, and nothing has resulted in change in spite of all the recommendations from various reports and studies that have been done, including the Commission to Promote Sustainable Children's Aid Societies in Ontario, and as I mentioned, the Auditor General.
Sarah, a long slog to get to this day, eh? How long has this case been going on?
Well, it was launched in February of 2007, and we just got the decision on Tuesday. So it's been 9 years.
9 years. Why did it take so long?
That's a very fair question. I would say the number one reason is because the federal government, at every turn that it could possibly stall the case, it did. So every opportunity that it could seek a review of a decision, anytime it could bring up a small jurisdictional point to argue, it used that opportunity to stall the case.
Now, in that case, that wouldn't have been governments of all stripes. That would have just been the Conservative government, I presume.
Correct.
Okay. Help me understand this. The ruling found that the funding formula that you referred to a moment ago, in some respects, incentivized removing First Nations kids from their homes. Can you help us understand that?
And I would say that's probably one of the most important findings of the decision, and it's not to be understated. The government knows that by underfunding these community agencies, it's driving kids into foster care at higher rates. There are more First Nations children in foster care today than at the height of the residential school era. So one of the things that happens under the formula is that they will pay for full costs of kids being in care, which is referred to as maintenance costs. So you get your full costs back when you put a child into foster care. But if you want to offer prevention services or pay your staff properly, have computers, have buildings that work, they will not pay those at cost. Those are fixed in a budget. And once you run out of that money, you either need to move funding around within your own organization or you just don't have that funding anymore. So for social workers who are offering services to these kids, if they know that a family is in need, maybe they need some parenting courses, maybe mom and dad need some substance abuse access to those services. Once the agency runs out of that funding stream, the government won't assist. So the only way they can offer that family any assistance is to take those kids into foster care.
Teresa, does the government use the same standards for deciding whether a child should stay in their home for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous families?
I can only speak for Ontario, but yes, we have the same, it's called the risk assessment model in Ontario. But as Sarah mentioned, those mainstream tools, when applied to Aboriginal children due to poverty, end up resulting in more children having to come into care because parents aren't able to meet the basic needs of their children, and all the resulting social issues that accompany poverty of of neglect and substance abuse and prevention. Substance abuse and family violence, and those are we need to stop focusing on child protection and begin to focus on prevention, because we know the reasons why children come into care, and we've got to start making those investments in treatment centers and counseling and services to families on reserve.
Now, the tribunal also referred to something called Jordan's Principle. Let's talk about that for a few moments here. What is that, first of all?
Jordan's Principle, as I understand it, is that the practice that whoever gets the request first is the first to respond and pay, and that we'll deal with our jurisdictional disputes between provinces and the feds and the agencies after us, but we have to respond.
And what's the significance, Sarah, of Jordan's Principle as it relates to what the tribunal found?
So Jordan's Principle, just as Teresa said, is really a child-first principle. The idea is that the government of first contact will pay for the service that a First Nations child needs. And I think it's important to note sort of where Jordan's Principle comes from and who's it about. Mm-hmm. Jordan's Principle comes from a child named Jordan River Anderson, who was born of the Norway House Cree Nation from Manitoba. He was born with very complicated medical needs and needed to stay in hospital for some time after he was born. But after about 2 years, doctors said, okay, you know what, Jordan? You want to get out of the hospital? This is not really a fun place for a little 2-year-old kid to live. You can go into a specialized medical foster care placement, because his parents had to enter him into the system to get him the services that he needed. But they said, you can go home. And the federal government in Manitoba said, well, I'm not paying for that medical equipment. I'm not paying for his foster care funding. And so he stayed in hospital until he was 5, and he died in hospital, never having left and lived in a family home environment. So Jordan's Principle arose out of that case. There was a private member's bill that passed in the House of Commons unanimously in 2007, which says that every child, whether they're on or off reserve, should have access to services that all other Canadians have. That's it. There's no magic to it. It's not a difficult thing to get your head around. That's what Jordan's Principle is. And this case says that the federal government has not been implementing the spirit of Jordan's Principle, nor the way that it was ever imagined to be implemented. They've said you've got to start implementing it properly. If that service is available to every other Canadian child, then the child should get the service, and you guys can fight about it later who's going to pay for it.
That seems like a no-brainer. Why is that so controversial?
You know, it's really unclear why it's controversial in terms of the rationale. It really comes down to money and funding.
As so many things do in this country.
Right.
Okay, Sarah, while you've got the floor, this is not merely a decision that is supposed to sit on a shelf somewhere and represents a victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory.
Right.
This actually is supposed to move the yardsticks.
Yes.
So tell us what that in effect means.
Well, I think that there are so many things that the federal government could do this minute. They know how to do it. One of the great things about the Auditor General reports, the Wenday reports, the National Policy Review is that they already have built-in recommendations on how to fix this problem. Very, very smart people across the country have been working on this issue for 10 to 15 years. They know what the problems are and they can fix it. So the decision calls on the federal government to immediately deal with this issue, and we haven't seen anything happen yet.
Well, the decision just came out, but this means money, right?
That's right, it means money, yes.
Okay, so Teresa, let me ask you about that. In terms of a federal government response to this Human Rights Tribunal report, what do you want to see happen?
Well, just as it's stated in the ruling, there is the plan for the tribunal to meet with all parties within 3 weeks to develop an action plan in terms of how they're going to begin to address the ruling. They're looking at expert panel to keep the people's foot to the fire in terms of making sure that they're moving forward. So I think the ruling itself and the tribunal itself ensured that there were mechanisms in place that this ruling was going to be implemented as soon as possible.
Well, one of the initial, Teresa, responses I heard was the federal government immediately in its next budget needs to increase funding to deal with these issues by a factor of, say, $150 million right away. Is that something that resonates with you?
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Is that the right number?
Well, we know in Ontario that, we, under the 65, that in spite of us having a better funding formula than the rest of Canada, we too have been underfunded, and there hasn't been comparable services to on and off reserve. So, we've been asking, like I said, our agency for the past 13 years has been spending $2 to $3 million alone just on sending kids for treatment. So 150 nationally is low, I would say.
And Teresa, would you be looking for compensation for past ills as well as increased funding going forward?
Well, in the ruling, it states that compensation is to be used for healing, and that's something that we've identified in our territory. Our communities had been so devastated by the 60s scoop. They lost hundreds, if not thousands, of children to crown worship and adoption around Canada and around the world. And, we have a lot of wounded warriors that they need healing. And so I'm gratified to see that tribunal acknowledge that and put some resourcings to that end. We've been asking for that for a long time.
Yeah, Sarah, let me follow up with you on that. What does the tribunal have to say about any specific dollar figures going forward in terms of remedying the past situation?
So on the request for individual remedies, that has not been granted yet. The tribunal has said we are very open to considering that. It certainly has the jurisdiction to grant reparations to what we say approximately 163,000 kids who have been brought into care since the year before the complaint was launched. That the tribunal has the jurisdiction to do that, and it will be posing follow-up questions to the parties about various issues around remedies, and that's one of the issues that they plan to follow up with.
But just so we're clear, this decision of this tribunal, it is legally binding, right?
Yes, and I would say one of the immediate steps that the federal government can take today would be to announce that they're not going to be appealing this decision. And that would be, I think that would go a long way to starting to put this tribunal decision into action.
Well, the Indigenous Affairs Minister, Carolyn Bennett, immediately said, I mean, her first reaction was not to say we're going to appeal. It was, how do we make this happen?
That's true, but they still have not said definitively that they're not going to appeal.
So you're looking for that?
I am really looking for that.
Let's see what, I mean, all eyes in some respects are on Jody Wilson-Raybould for a number of reasons. Never mind that she's the Justice Minister. She is the first Indigenous Minister of Justice in Canadian history, and here's what she had to say about the ruling. Sheldon, roll the clip, please.
This is a good day. For myself, and I think for who, as Canadians and the values that we have, this is about equality. This is about ensuring that there is equal investment, and it's not just in terms of money, it's in terms of outcomes, that we create the space in this country for every child to be able to succeed.
Teresa, this was a party, the Liberals, that won an election pledging real change. Do you expect to see real change given this tribunal decision?
Well, I'm happy to hear what the minister said in terms of this isn't just about money. This is about restoring hope and, restoring the inherent integrity of the Aboriginal family unit and community, and restoring human dignity.
Sarah? How long should you think it's reasonable to give the government for its response to all of this?
24 hours. Honestly, and I know that sounds kind of crazy given that it's just come out, but as I said before, all of the mechanisms in terms of remedying these issues, all of the work has already been done. So there isn't really much in terms of timing to get done. The parties obviously do need to meet. We need to hear more from the tribunal about specific remedies. So those things do need to happen, but in terms of taking immediate steps, there are things that they can start doing today.
Green light go is what you're saying.
That's right.
Got it. Teresa Stevens, Sarah Clark, great to have both of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for your help on this.
Thanks.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.